Welcome to a 10-minute chess lesson on the Queen's Gambit. So let's get started. So the opening Queen's Gambit starts with the moves d4, d5 and pawn to c4. But before we discuss this position, there's a few key concepts that we have to keep in our mind to understand why we want to reach this position and why it is such a commonly played position. When it comes to chess and you want to checkmate your opponent brutally, there's two moves that are very common in chess, and those two moves are pawn to d4 and pawn to e4. White enjoys playing both of these moves as the opening move because these moves help control the entire 5th rank and puts pressure on black's position. But the key difference between the move pawn to e4 and the move pawn to d4 is the difference that one has the queen behind the pawn and the other has the king behind the pawn. And you guys are like, obviously, that's why it's called the queen's pawn or the king's pawn opening.
You fucking don't.
But that's not the point behind me saying that. It's just that when you push the move pawn to e4, your king no longer defends the pawn. But if you were to push the move pawn to d4, your queen continues to defend the pawn. Because this will help you develop strategies through the opening and the middle game phase of the chess match, and it will help you crush your opponents and checkmate them. And because in the queen's pawn opening, the queen's pawn is always defended by the queen, so any reply from black, irrespective of what black replies with, we are ready to push the move pawn to c4. Since one of your central pawns are already defended, the only pawn you have to get busy defending is the c pawn. So now let's talk for a while about the most common replies to the move pawn to d4. The most common replies to the move pawn to d4 are knight to f6 and also the move pawn to d5. Now in order to reach the Queen's Gambit, black has to reply the move pawn to d5, so we are going to focus on that for this video. And at that point in time when we reply with the move pawn to c4 is the Queen's Gambit. From this point on, black has a few different options, and by few different options, there are really three options that you will come across all the time, and those three options are pawn captures pawn, defending the central pawn with the move pawn to e6, or the move pawn to c6. Let's first talk about the move pawn captures pawn, which is black capturing the c pawn with black's own d pawn, which looks like this. And depending on what kind of a player you are and what kind of matches you want to play, there's two options that I consider are very strong options at this point, and the one that is more common is defending the d pawn with the move pawn to e3. But there's another option that we are going to discuss, and that is the move pawn to e4. So let's first talk about the more commonly played move, which is pawn to e3. We are opening up lines for our light square bishop so that it can attack the pawn, and we are threatening to pick up black's pawn with the move bishop captures on c4. Now black really doesn't have too many good ways of defending the pawn. One of the moves that's very commonly played, and it's not really a good move, is the move pawn to b5. And at this point it's very important as white to play the next few moves with a tempo. We really can't waste much time to take advantage of black's mistakes, and we have to strike back with the move pawn to a4. What this does is threatens black's defender of the pawn, b pawn, and threatens to pick up the c pawn on the next move. At this point, black has two obvious moves in mind. One is the move pawn to a6, which is not really a good move because white can just continue to capture on the b pawn, and that can't be captured back since the rook hangs directly, and that would be a completely winning position for white. On the other hand, black's other option, pawn to c6, is also not a good move because white can still continue to capture the b pawn, and in case black does recapture, white has this completely winning move, which is queen to f3. And at this point, the rook is completely hanging and there's no way for black to defend it. Black can choose to give up either the knight or the bishop instead of the rook, but that's the max black can get out of this position. So games can continue to follow the path knight to c6, queen captures on c6, which comes with a check, and black can defend that with the bishop, and the queen would guard the rook. So the black can either give up the knight or the bishop. Black can give up the bishop in this fashion. When this move comes, you can pick up the bishop, and then the knight can move and the queen once again defends the rook. But black would have to give up a minor piece at this point. The other defensive resource for black after the move pawn to e3, which is bishop to e6, is also not a good one because this blocks off the dark square bishop's diagonal, where white can just continue to develop rapidly with moves like knight to c3, pawn to e4, and once the pawn move forward, the bishop's diagonal opens up and the light square bishop will continue to threaten the pawn. So while black's position is completely stifled. So this is the case wherein the queen's gambit is not really a real gambit. You can always win back the pawn. But there's another scenario where in this position, white may actually want to take the complete center with the move pawn to e4. And at this position, black can choose to defend the pawn. And if black does defend the pawn, white can't immediately take back. This would be a positional sacrifice where players who like to play really aggressively would really enjoy playing this position. And notice, when you play positions like these, you continue to develop. And black can never really threaten your knight over here because the move queen to a4 simply puts a check. And no matter how black chooses to defend this position, the queen can simply pick up the pawn in the next move. So your knight on c3 is secure even if you choose to play the move e4. It's just that the tactics that come with the move pawn to a4 don't really work the same anymore, because after these captures take place, the move queen to f3 doesn't really come with an attack on the rook. Rather, it turns to a losing position for white because black has the move knight to c6, which can lead to pretty disastrous situation for white with a double attack on the queen's pawn. So the queen's gambit accepted would usually progress in the manner wherein white threatens the pawn, black doesn't defend the pawn, black continues development, and white can just pick up this pawn and just continue to play the match, having this superior position where the bishop is already developed to a very strong diagonal, threatening black's king side, and the other pieces would be developed pretty soon. Depending on your choices, you would put the bishop on this diagonal, or you could even push the move pawn to e4 and then choose to develop the bishop on this diagonal. And the knight will simply be developed to f3 and white can easily castle on the king side and have a completely safe, enjoyable position. Now let's briefly discuss the positions that arise when black chooses to defend the central pawn with one of his own pawns. So in this position, you want to continue playing with the same set of moves, which would include the move knight to c3. Black can choose from a number of different setups, which could include developing the knight, and you would just continue to develop your own dark square bishop, which is fundamental because you do want to close your pawn chain with the move pawn to e3, and you don't want your bishop trapped in this diagonal. Black could choose to unpin his knight with the next move, and we would continue in the same fashion, develop the knight to f3. Black can play a different set of moves, can also castle. We would just continue to push our e-pawn, and we would prepare next to develop our bishop and castle on the king side and have a same safe game. There's also one more thing that I would like you to remember. Some interesting tactics could actually develop on your c3 knight. How can this happen? You can continue to develop your bishop anywhere in this diagonal next to your planning to close your pawn chain and develop your light square bishop. But black says, nah, I just want to go into the attack. So sometimes pressure can develop in these positions, and if you play too slowly, black might actually get significant amount of pressure on your knight, and you don't really want to allow that. Right now you see there are two attackers on the knight, but there's just one defender. You would have to defend with moves like queen to c2 and rook to c3. And since this knight is pinned, the knight from f6 can also jump in to e5 and put significant pressure on the knight. So be aware of the tactics that can develop on c3 when you're putting your bishop outside of the pawn chain. It's very important that when you develop this bishop, you don't actually hang this knight or lose a pawn for no reason on the c file. So that's all for this video. Take care and tell me how you feel about this opening. Play it in your matches. I'm sure it will win a lot of games. And like and subscribe to the channel if you are enjoying this content.